Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest in our series of Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Brianne Eby, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at ENO. Today we're presenting There's No Tool Like Curbs, the powerful mobility tool every city already has. Cities are looking to their transportation systems to promote mobility, safety, equity, climate, and accessibility goals. Some trends, such as the growth in e-commerce and ride-hailing, are making achieving these goals more complex. Cities can be stymied, sometimes by other levels of government, in efforts to combat congestion. But cities typically exercise significant control over their streets, sidewalks, and curb space. Curb space management policy is a powerful tool cities already have, which, if leveraged strategically, can be a powerful tool to reach mobility goals. This webinar will discuss the ways cities can develop policies for valuable curb space to drive their larger objectives. Our presenter today is Dawn Miller, the head of policy and partnerships at COORD, a platform that helps cities manage curbs. After the presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions. And for those listening in, you're encouraged to submit questions and comments through the questions function on the webinar. You don't have to wait until the speaker is done to submit those questions. You can do it at any time. Thank you again for joining us today. And with that, take it away, Dawn.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in today. It seems there's a real flurry of webinars these days, but the ENO Center has been providing this service to all of us for a long time. Which is the agency that regulates taxis and ride-hailing. My presentation today will start with some background on curb management. Then I'll describe what we see as the four main steps on what we call the city's curb management journey. After that, I'll go through some examples of what actual cities are doing today in terms of curb management. I'll conclude with some thoughts on where I think this field is going in the coming years, and of course, I look forward to your questions at the end. But first, I wanted to begin with some setup about what got me so interested in curbs. When I was in city government, there were lots of problems right in front of us, but unfortunately, the straightforward solutions were often not available to us because we didn't have the jurisdiction to implement them. If you look at this chart, you'll see the growth in the various for-hire services in New York City, and you'll see ride-hailing in blue starting to appear in 2013 and then growing significantly in 2014. We at TLC were getting something like 2,000 new vehicle applications a month with no signs of slowing down. We were getting very concerned about what might happen to our streets and drivers if the market became oversaturated. In New York City, most ride-hail drivers were purchasing new vehicles to enter the business, making it a significant financial investment. At TLC, we were legally required to issue a license to any qualified applicant. Therefore, back in 2015, our agency tried to get authority from our city council to manage growth in the fleet size, but they said no. Another approach to managing the congestion would have been using taxes or fees on rides to manage demand, but this would have required New York State legislation. Congestion fees finally got through several years later, but this wasn't something grabbing state legislators' attention back in 2015. Another approach would have attempted to mitigate emissions by at least requiring new vehicles to be hybrids or other energy-efficient vehicles, but a similar TLC policy years ago was struck down in court as a violation of the Federal Clean Air Act, which I find quite ironic. While New York City Council and New York State took some years before passing legislation to attempt to address the problem more directly, my agency got creative. We developed a minimum earnings policy for ride-hail drivers, which was within our existing authority. We designed it in such a way that it also gave ride-hail companies a strong financial incentive not to grow and grow and grow. For the first time, Uber and Lyft stopped aggressively recruiting drivers, and the numbers started to decline gradually. And this is what brings me to the curb. What I love about the curb is that control over it is generally largely already in cities' control. Although city councils often control elements of curb policy, often broad authority has already been delegated to the local transportation agency or parking authority. And while the curb can't do everything, I believe it can really do a lot to help cities meet their goals without having to go to other levels of government to ask permission. This is so important because curb policy both creates incentives for how people decide to travel and is a demonstration of a city's values. Cities decide whether their curb space is reserved for individuals to park, or whether they want to dedicate it to other things they care about. Things like supporting transit, cycling, local business, or vibrant public spaces. By creating free spaces to do one thing or charging users to do another thing, a city is either encouraging or discouraging that activity at that location. So I think a lot of cities are on board with most of what I've just said, but the question we often get is, how do you actually do curb management? We think about it in these four steps: inventory, allocate, price, and operate. And I'll go through each of these one by one. So the first step in the curb management journey is actually quite literally to know where they are in space and what assets like signs or hydrants or curb ramps are on them. To us, inventory goes a step further to who can use a specific stretch of curb at a given time, for what activity, for how long, and at what price. Many cities don't have this information in a digital format at all. If they do, it might be spread out among a bunch of different files and not truly usable for a planner. So a good first step is to get a handle on what you have today and make it easily accessible to your team. Once you can quantify and visualize what you have, you can see if it aligns with what your city's vision and goals are. If you care about bus travel times and reliability, should some of your curbside parking actually be bus lanes or curb extensions? If you care about safe cycling and walking, should you have more space for loading so delivery and service vehicles don't double park in spaces set aside for pedestrians or cyclists? If you care about your local retail, should premium spaces right in front be high turnover 15-minute spots rather than long-term parking used by people who stay in the neighborhood for longer? And I don't underestimate the challenges planners face in trying to reallocate space. However, having the real numbers to back up your proposals can be very powerful. So as an example, if you're removing a lane of parking for another use, it's somewhat helpful and really necessary to explain to the community that this means there will be 20 fewer parking spaces on that street. But for people who want to make change, it's even more helpful if they can explain that these spaces only represent 5% of parking in the walk shed. And it's even more helpful than that if you can say that in this area, typically only 75% of parking is occupied at peak times. So therefore, even with this reallocation, there's enough parking in the area. So inventory and occupancy data help planners tell the complete story to bring their communities along as they reallocate space. After you've decided what allocations you want, you need policy, prices, and regulations to make them real. Pricing is an extremely powerful policy tool. With the right data at your fingertips, repricing parking can be done at a more granular level and more frequently to meet availability targets. If you want to cut down on circling for parking or loading space, you can calibrate parking or loading prices up or down until you achieve a target availability level. Finally, you can more dynamically operate your curbs to really impact driver behavior. More and more of our vehicles are, 1, operating in fleets, and 2, using a navigation or a dispatch app. Navigation and transit apps using real-time traffic and transit data have now become mainstream parts of how we get around. Similarly, we can make locating and paying for loading and parking space a seamless part of these digitally guided trips. Right now, drivers are heavily reliant on mazes of metal signs to try to figure out where they can stop, load, or park. Although signs on the street can't disappear entirely, they can be made more flexible. When cities sign a space as a flexible zone and then digitally communicate who may use the curb, at what price, and for how long, they can more easily change how their space can be used. In the short term, they can change allocations in response to things like special events or construction or emergencies, which we've seen many cities do in response to COVID-19. In the long term, they can change allocations as priorities change, our modal mix changes, or to adapt to new technologies like autonomous vehicles. So that's all kind of nice background. So what I'll do next is tell you about what some actual cities are doing today in each of these steps along the journey. So the city of Pittsburgh is a great example of inventory. Their new Department of Mobility and Infrastructure has an ambitious new bike master plan. The city is working to provide other alternatives to single occupancy vehicle travel through the Pittsburgh Mobility Collective you may have heard about. The collective is a collaboration between the city and an all-star list of mobility companies, and it will introduce electric pedal assist bikes, expand car share, introduce new carpool and shared ride services, and improve trip planning. As you might imagine, all of these initiatives interface with the city's curb space. Pittsburgh didn't have a curb inventory, so they're now working to digitize their curb space so they can incorporate curbs into all of their existing planning efforts. The city of Boulder is a great example of a proactive approach to allocation. They're working on a curb space planning to align their curb use with the goals in their transportation master plan. In particular, ensuring curb use policy aligns with Boulder's goals to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips and support walking and biking. Boulder is also looking at curbs through the lens of their Vision Zero goals. Finally, they're engaging in curb management planning to prepare for autonomous vehicles. By developing a set of priorities for curb space and gaining experience managing how drivers use curb space, the city will be a step ahead in ensuring AVs are deployed in ways that enhance quality of life in the city. Seattle is a really great example of the pricing component of the curb management journey. They have a goal of reducing circling for parking by targeting 1 or 2 available spaces per block. We achieve this by analyzing parking occupancy relative to supply and adjusting prices up or down. Pricing also helps them improve availability where it's oversubscribed. They can also reduce prices where data shows there's ample supply. Cities, including Baltimore, Boston, LA, San Francisco, and DC also do some sort of form of demand responsive pricing. It's also worth discussing parking pricing in the context of congestion pricing. So congestion pricing is a notoriously controversial policy, and in some cases, cities lack the authority to implement it on their own. In the case of New York City, the city could not implement this policy on their own. We needed state legislation. However, cities already control 2 related policy arenas, parking pricing and parking availability, which are regulated through parking and zoning ordinances. These existing powers can be leveraged as their own form of congestion pricing. If parking is cheap and plentiful, more people will drive downtown. If it's not, and you can get downtown by transit or maybe a bike, fewer people will drive downtown. Seattle is also a great example of reallocating and repricing space in response to COVID-19. They used their digital inventory to identify locations where restaurants were focusing on deliveries and pickups as residents were ordered to stay at home, but where there wasn't existing loading space. They used this curb intelligence to inform where they cited new restaurant loading zones. Seattle also created a hospital worker parking permit program, and they actually eliminated parking fees and many time limits to improve access during the crisis. And the city of Dublin, Ireland is an example of a city getting ready to pilot more actively operating its curbs. They're creating what they're calling virtual zones for loading to improve the efficiency of loading in their downtown. In this case, the on-street regulation with a double yellow line would only permit a shorter loading event. In this pilot, participating commercial drivers can see via a mobile app exceptions the city has made to the on-street regulations, and they can digitally see locations where the city has at a given time and permitted loading for longer than the default regulation would have permitted. And so this gives the city a lot more flexibility to provide more space when and where they can and they need it. So that's a taste of some of what real cities are doing today. So I'll finish up by sharing with you a few trends that we see coming down the pike in curb management. First, I see more cities digitizing their curb space. We're all learning so many lessons in this current crisis, and one of them is certainly the importance of flexible public spaces. We're delighted to see so many cities changing their streets, their curbs, and other public spaces to accommodate what we need today. They are communicating these changes to the public through channels like websites, on-street signage, and collaborations with apps like Waze. And changes to curb space could be made that much more dynamically and communicated that much more effectively if all the apps we use for transportation planning and for navigation also included a live stream of the information about who may use the curb, when, where, and how, and at what price, and if the city had the tools to modify it in real time to meet changing conditions. Second, I see cities translating their overarching curb strategies and prioritizations into more specific curb allocation plans and policy changes. With so many curb faces, without digitization, this task is a little daunting, but with a digital curb inventory, it becomes less so. So inspired by many of the cities we speak with, we've been working on a metric called the curb index. The index will help you assess how well your curbs are serving commercial, residential, or other needs. And we think this type of tool will provide a strong starting point for cities to see where they are today. What you need from your curbs depends a lot on the context, such as the surrounding land uses and density. So tools like curb index scores will help a city decide what changes they need to make to align their curbs with their priorities in a very specific setting. I also expect more cities will develop and actually garner the political support to enact policies that reflect what many transportation professionals have been saying for a long time. The curb is more than a space for long-term vehicle storage. This means not only that cities will make space for other uses, but also that they will begin pricing other uses, such as loading. Cities who are already moving in this direction with the growth in e-commerce, Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco, New York, were already charging drivers for loading time. And I expect COVID-19 will accelerate this process for two reasons. One is the continued growth in curbside pickup and delivery activity. And unfortunately, because coming years to pilot and engage in broader rollouts of these active curb operations programs like I've described. And I think this is going to happen because there's a confluence of three important factors. First, there are congestion and coordination problems at the curb. This competition for space has always been there, but it's gotten worse with recent mobility changes such as e-commerce, ride-hailing, and micromobility. Second, there's growing policy interest in curb space management. And this is really evidenced by things like the tremendous interest in the Transportation for America Smart Cities Collaborative Program, which is focusing on curb management this year. And third, there is the technology available that supports these types of programs. So I think these three factors combined will make active curb operations an attractive option for more cities in the coming years. And so that's it for me in terms of the formal presentation. Thank you all for your attention and tuning in. And I'd like to close with this picture. Somehow I've managed to spend most of my career talking about cars and congestion. Somewhat ironically, there's not much that brings a grin to my face more than what you see here, which is being part of a bona fide rush hour bicycle traffic jam. So I hope all of you have the opportunity to be in a bicycle traffic jam sometime soon. So thanks again for tuning in, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dawn. And to those listening in, don't forget you can continue to submit questions. We'll try to hit as many as we can. So Dawn, you mentioned a little bit about some changes that have been made in Seattle in response to the COVID epidemic. Just wondering if you can talk a little bit about some other examples of how your operations have changed in response to the crisis. Are there pilots that are shifting? How have general attitudes toward your service changed? What are some plans for the future? Any elaboration on the current situation would be great.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've been very inspired to seeing how quickly a lot of cities have really kind of broken through red tape and usual procedures to do new things in their curb space and just kind of come together. Like, what does each agency and what each division with each agency have, and how can that be thrown behind the efforts of the current crisis? So the thing that I'm seeing probably the most is what I mentioned with creation of new, basically loading space. because there's just a lot more pickup and delivery activity in commercial areas. And it's seen not just as a transportation issue, but really as an economic development tool for cities that are trying to help small businesses stay afloat in these times. So that's been really cool. The other thing that's been really cool has been really trying to use COORD policy to protect our medical workers. Many of them don't have the opportunity to use a car to socially distance and don't have a choice but to stay in transit. And transit agencies are doing a lot to try to make that as good an experience as it could be, considering the circumstances. But there are places around the country where hospital workers who might ordinarily take the bus do find access to a car, and then they need a place to park it downtown, where maybe there were a bunch of usual restrictions for residents or time limits or things like that. And they've come together really quickly and worked with hospitals directly to create permitting programs for hospital workers. The other thing, I'm hearing, and this is more of a medium term policy, is this issue with respect to revenue. A lot of municipal budgets are really, really being decimated. And I think I'm hearing more chatter, and I think it's creating an opportunity. It's been good policy from a transportation perspective to want to price curb space, provide more loading space, probably charge for that loading space if it's in a valuable location. But it's very hard to get that through. Parking policy can be brutal. But I think that this crisis creates an opportunity where people might be more open to doing things differently, and might accelerate the trend towards creating more loading space, and then really taking it to the next level where it provides both a good service to the people who are using it, all of these drivers, while at the same time creating a revenue opportunity for cities who very much need it.
That's great. Thank you. Some questions about what are some of the reasons that cities list for not adopting this platform. Can you talk to or speak at all to why cities do choose to adopt this, and some reasons that they have for not adopting this new service?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple primary barriers. One is simply bandwidth. As a former city government person myself, it is a real thing that you are pulled in many, many directions to do a lot of different things, and sometimes you only have so much time to devote to any new planning initiative or set of policy changes. Each requires a lot of stakeholder outreach and analytics and research. So sometimes cities, are very much on board with a lot of this stuff, but this year has been planned out with trying to get a certain RFP together or a certain other plan that's also very important together. So sometimes it's bandwidth and understanding that, we try to design with that in mind. How does our tool, help cities do things that they were doing anyway, but do them more quickly or more cheaply, so that it's not just like another thing to do, but a thing that takes some weight off workers who really have a lot of demands on their time. And I think the other big barrier is really politics. I'm heartened to see that a lot of cities where politics aren't that easy have managed to roll out demand responsive parking pricing, begin charging for loading, take space for bike lanes and bus lanes and micromobility parking. So it does get done, but it can be a lot to bring stakeholders along and really educate them about the benefits of these changes, when maybe they traditionally might think that their customers would drive and park in front of their store, and that's really how their customers were getting there, and losing that would really cost them business. But getting the information to show, actually, this is how your customers get here, or these are the benefits of other uses, but that is real time and work. And so I think it's the bandwidth problem and the political issue and all of the work that goes into overcoming the political challenges.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions wondering about how your service can sync with other policy goals and mandates. So for example, safety, traffic, environmental goals, cities have financial goals, obviously have to protect and provide disabled parking access. So how do you ensure that these are met and determine how to achieve the right balance between other policy goals and mandates?
Yeah, I mean, I talked with one of my about kind of the power that cities have over their curb space as being one of the things that got me really interested in the curb. But the other was actually safety. I worked a lot on Vision Zero issues when I worked for the city of New York, and with the growth in e-commerce and ride hail, bike lanes were being very chronically blocked by vehicles. And for anyone who rides a bike, that is a pretty harrowing experience, trying to figure out how to get around all of these vehicles, and the space that was allocated for you to be safer isn't really there for you. And so, we, talked to ride-hailing drivers. The ride-hail drivers don't want to be there blocking your bike lane, but they don't have a lot of space to go. It's like, so if we don't go there, then where do we go? And I think that, and that was something the cycling advocates agreed with. And so, kind of both of them were coming to the agreement that, we need more space for passenger loading. And so I think basically a lot of our curbs haven't changed as much as they should, considering how we get around has changed so much, and it is creating these safety issues. But I think those are things that are not wholly solvable, but where you can make a significant impact by changing your curb space, and that's creating those passenger pickup areas where they should be, so that drivers have a place to go. And in the case of going the next step farther, having the dispatch and navigation apps that drivers are already using incorporate that data, so they're routed to these places where they can do pickup and drop off safely. Similarly, thinking about planning a bike corridor or a transit priority corridor, you really have to think about loading along that corridor, or you can run into real problems with loading blocking that bus or that bike lane. So how do you look around the corner? Are there opportunities on those perpendicular streets to create loading zones so that the people who need to load have somewhere to go? Because we can't kind of ignore the changes and the safety impacts they're making and the transit impacts they're making. We have to change how we're using space. And so that was kind of a big diatribe on safety. Happy to get into other things, but I mean, I guess the other one that we hear about a lot is really just the environmental emissions impacts of people who are circling for parking. Like that's not good for anyone, and there's unnecessary VMT, congestion, emissions, and so programs like Seattle's, where they use pricing to create availability so that people are doing a lot less circling for parking, create a better experience for those users, but also reduce unnecessary congestion and emissions in that city. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to leverage curb policy, especially when that policy is communicated out to users digitally and where they are already, which is increasingly using apps. I think that can be very powerful.
And I think we have time for one final question. A few came in about data and the possibility of making data openly available so that it's able to be used by more people. Is there any movement toward that, or do you see that as an option in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super important. It's something we talk with a lot with the cities we work with. And so I think the starting point is that right now, often these data just don't exist. And that was why, my company invested in developing a tool to help collect these information in a way that is very precise and accurate, and easy for cities to get that done. And so then we work with cities when we decide to work with them to figure out what's your approach to getting the data out to all of the different users who are interested, and how can we help you do that through a well-supported API, through kind of data quality checks and all of that stuff. So it's something we talk to our city partners a lot about, like what is the solution that kind of helps them maintain their data quality and accuracy stuff while also providing access. And we think that this actually is another potential opportunity for cities to really partner with some of those private mobility companies who are interested in using these data to help with their routing and things like that, and leveraging digital curb data in partnership with the private mobility companies.
We will leave it at that for today. Thank you all for your participation, and we will be posting today's slides on our website. ENO plans to stay engaged in this larger issue, and in fact, we just added another webinar on this topic for next Thursday, May 7th, featuring Rob Stiles from Analyst. I also want to encourage you all to subscribe to ENO Transportation Weekly, an invaluable source on all aspects of transportation policy practice. Well, thank you for your participation and have a great afternoon.
Bye, thanks everyone.